They erased my land from the papers penned, but my father left proof they never found.
At 73 years old, Marvell Bledsoe stood on the front porch of a house she would never stand on again and placed her hand on the wooden railing her husband had built the summer of 1975. She did not do it to hold on. She did it to remember. Garrison had spent 3 weekends on that railing. She could still see him younger, then crouched on one knee with a mallet in his hand, checking each mortise joint before moving to the next. He had been proud of the way the boards fit together without gaps. She remembered standing in the doorway, watching him work a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, thinking that this was what a life looked like when it was being built by someone who meant it. That man had not shown up for a long time. The morning air moved slowly down the street, carrying the smell of wet leaves and something colder underneath. The sky was the color of old pewter. Marvell was dressed simply a gray coat, buttoned to the collar, her silver hair pinned at the back of her neck. 2 small suitcases stood at the base of the porch steps. She had packed them in under an hour. 50 years of marriage and the things that truly belonged to her fit into 2 bags without much effort. She had signed the papers 3 days ago. The attorney's office had been on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of building with thick carpet and framed degrees arranged on walls so that clients would feel the weight of credentials before anyone said a word. Marvel had sat in a leather chair across a long table and looked at the man who had prepared everything. His name was Warren Tolliver. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that came from decades of sitting in rooms where he controlled the outcome. His suit was more expensive than the occasion required. He had the practiced calm of someone who delivered bad news often enough that it no longer registered as bad news to him, only as the conclusion of a process. He placed the documents in front of her with the care of someone arranging things for a photograph. The prenuptial agreement from 1974 was valid, he explained. Everything had been properly filed. The house, the accounts, the vehicle. All of it had remained in Garrison's name through mechanisms that Marvell had never fully understood, and that Tolliver summarized with the kind of efficiency designed to discourage questions. Marvel read every page. She was not a fast reader. She had never pretended to be, but she was a careful one, and she moved through each section the way she had always moved through things that required her full attention without rushing, without performing patience she did not feel. Tolliver glanced at his watch once, briefly, but she caught it. The document ran to 28 pages. She read all of them. And somewhere around page 14 in a section listing all marital property and assessed assets, she noticed something. Or rather, she noticed the absence of something. A place name she could not have explained why she remembered. Granger County. It surfaced in her memory the way old things do, without context, without a clear source, just a name she had heard somewhere long ago and filed away without meaning to. It was not listed anywhere in the 28 pages. She did not ask about it. She signed where she was instructed. Her hand was steady. She had learned a long time ago not to show the moment she understood something. In the corner of the room, a man sat in a chair he had no legal reason to occupy. Jasper Tyndall was 48 years old, Garrison's son, from the marriage that came before Marvell. He had always looked at her the way a property owner looks at someone who has been renting a room with a tolerance that carried an expiration date built into it from the beginning. He wore a suit that morning. He held his phone with the screen facing down on his knee, which meant he was not looking at it. He was watching. When Marvell stood to leave, she moved toward the door without looking at him. He spoke as she passed. "My father should have done this 20 years ago." He said it quietly. Not to wound, that was what made it worse. He said it the way someone states a fact they have been waiting a long time to say out loud. Marvell did not stop walking. She carried those words with her, out of the building, down 4 floors in an elevator, and across the parking lot to the cab she had arranged. She carried them for 3 days through the mechanical process of packing, of canceling, of redirecting the small logistical threads of a life she was unraveling with minimal noise. And now she stood on the porch with her hand on the railing and let herself feel one final time the particular weight of a place that had belonged to her for 50 years and had somehow quietly stopped being hers. She stepped down from the porch. She did not look back. Not because it didn't matter, because it mattered too much and she understood the difference. The bus station was 12 minutes away by cab. She sat in the back seat with her 2 bags beside her and watched the neighborhood she had lived in for decades pass by the window, with the indifference of scenery that had never been asked whether it wanted to be looked at. The bus itself smelled of diesel and upholstery, and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces traveled through repeatedly. Marvell took a window seat near the middle and set her smaller bag on her lap. Outside, the city began to give way first to the wider blocks of the outer neighborhoods, then to the flat commercial sprawl at the edges, and then gradually to open land. The sky grew larger as the buildings fell away. That was always how it worked out here. Not because the sky changed, but because there was finally nothing left to interrupt it. A man sat across the aisle from her. He had a weathered face and wore a flannel shirt beneath a jacket that had seen better decades. His boots had dried mud along the soles. He glanced at her once briefly and gave the smallest possible nod. She returned it. There was a language between people who carried more than they spoke about. It did not require words, and it was one of the few things Marvel had found more reliable with age rather than less. The driver announced the final stop in a voice that had made the same announcement many times before. Marvel stepped down onto gravel. The bus pulled away before the dust from its departure had settled. She stood alone. The road ahead was familiar in the way that very old memories are familiar. Not sharp and detailed, but present in the body rather than the mind. Her feet knew the direction before she had consciously confirmed it. She walked along the shoulder, her bags in hand, the air around her carrying the smell of turned earth and something faintly sweet she could not identify until she realized it was the specific smell of this particular piece of ground, one she had not breathed in 15 years. The dirt road appeared on her left, narrow and uneven, edged by grass that had grown without supervision for a long time. She turned onto it without slowing. The fence line had shifted in places. Posts that had stood straight when she last walked this way had developed opinions about vertical. The trees along the property edge had grown into each other overhead, their branches tangled into a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into something uneven and soft. She passed under them and continued. When the house came into view, she stopped. It was smaller than she remembered, not because it had shrunk, but because she had spent 15 years carrying a version of it in her memory that had grown in the way remembered things grow larger and more definite than the reality. The paint had faded to an uneven, dull white. One section of the roof on the right side dipped slightly, as if it had grown tired of the effort. The windows were filmed with years of dust gray and opaque in the afternoon light. But it was standing. That was not nothing. That was in fact the specific thing she needed it to be. She stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, and then something moved near the base of the porch. A dog stepped out from beneath the boards. Old thin through the hindquarters, its fur a patchwork of brown and white that had gone ungroomed long enough to tangle in places without losing its underlying softness. One ear stood upright, the other folded forward at the tip as if it had given up on the effort partway through. Its eyes were cloudy at the edges but not empty. There was a tension in them. There was patience. It did not bark. It did not run toward her or away from her. It simply waited the way certain animals wait for things they have learned are worth waiting for. Marvell set her bag down and took 2 steps forward, moving slowly and without urgency. The dog watched her approach. When she crouched and extended her hand, it paused for a moment, then leaned forward and pressed the top of its head against her fingers. The contact was small, but it was real and it was offered freely, and those two things together meant something she did not have a word for. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll manage." She picked up her bag and climbed the porch steps. Each one creaked with the specific complaint of old wood that had expanded and contracted through too many seasons without attention. At the door, she reached into her coat pocket and found the key she had been carrying for 15 years without once testing it. It was old, the edges worn smooth. She held it for a moment longer than necessary, understanding that the act of putting it into the lock was not a small thing. The door opened with resistance, then gave. A breath of stale air moved outward, carrying the particular stillness of rooms that had waited a long time in the dark. Marvell stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath her. The light from the doorway stretched across dusty boards and reached the outlines of furniture that had sat in the same positions for 15 years without anyone to move them. Behind her, the dog followed without being invited. She stood in the center of the front room for a moment, not thinking about anything specific, just feeling the weight of the place and the particular quality of its silence, which was different from emptiness. Emptiness had a hollowness to it. This was something else. This was a space that had been full once and was simply waiting to be full again. She did not feel ready, but she no longer felt like she was standing outside her own life. And that was enough for the moment she was in. That first night, she did not sit in the dark. That was important, though. She could not have explained exactly why. Something in her understood that stillness in an empty house at 73, in the first hours of whatever this was, would become a weight she might not lift from. So instead, she lit the 2 candles she found in a kitchen drawer, and she worked. Not with a plan, not with a list. She simply began at the nearest corner and moved outward, clearing dust, finding surfaces, learning the current condition of things, rather than sitting with imagined ones. In a kitchen drawer swollen with years of moisture, she found the expected accumulation of a house left behind. A few rubber bands dried to brittleness, a handful of mismatched keys to unknown locks, a small tin that had once held buttons, and beneath the tin, a collection of seed packets. She held them up to the candlelight. Some were decades old, their paper brittle, their contents almost certainly spent. But a few sealed better than the others, and stored in the relative cool of the tin, felt different in her hands, heavier, more plausible. She set them on the table and kept moving. It was the corner of the kitchen wall that stopped her. The dust there was thicker than anywhere else in the room, accumulated in the particular way of things that have been left undisturbed for a very long time. When she crouched to clear it, her hand found the edge of a wooden box. She pulled it free with both hands. It was small, light, worn smooth along the edges in the way of the objects that had been handled often before they were set aside. She brought it to the table, set it under the candle, and opened it. Inside, nestled in a slight depression that suggested they had been placed with care, were several notebooks. Their covers had softened with age, the corners gently rounded from use. Beneath them, a few photographs lay loose, their colors faded to something gentler and more muted than their original tones. Marvel sat down. She reached for the top notebook and opened it to the first page. She knew immediately whose it was. The handwriting was her mother's. Eustace Bledsoe had written every day for as long as Marvell could remember, not in the manner of someone composing a memoir, but in the quiet, practical way of someone who believed the small facts of each day were worth recording because each day was in fact worth the effort of being recorded. Planted beans this morning. Ground still a little dry. Marvell read the line twice, then turned the page. Eggs were fewer today. Might need to check the hens. And another. Cold wind came through the north side again. Nothing important. She read without looking for anything. The pages were a record of ordinary days, weather and animals and neighbors and small repairs, a life lived without drama or interruption, measured in seasons and small tasks, and the kind of consistency that only becomes visible when you step far enough back to see the whole of it. She was somewhere in the middle of the second notebook when she read a line that made her pause. Leland had brought firewood today without being asked. Said it might get cold next week. He doesn't talk much, but he means what he does. Marvell held the page under the candlelight. She did not know yet that she would meet this man. She only knew that the name was familiar in the abstract way of names heard in childhood and not thought about since, and that the way her mother had written about him carried the specific warmth of someone she trusted. She set the notebook down and reached for the photographs. Her parents stood in front of the house in a picture she had never seen before. Her father was younger than she had ever really known him to be, broad-shouldered and squinting slightly against the sun, one hand resting on her mother's shoulder without weight or performance. Just the ease of a man standing next to the person who made standing anywhere feel like the right place. Her mother was looking at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, more like the look of someone who is paying close attention to everything and finding it sufficient. Behind them, the garden was full, green and structured, and clearly tended by someone who understood what they were doing. Marvel sat with the photograph for a long time. Then she found it. In the last notebook, tucked into the final pages, folded into quarters, and worn at the creases from having been folded and unfolded many times. A small square of paper in her mother's handwriting, the ink faded almost to the color of the page. She unfolded it carefully. For you when you need it most. Find Bertice Garnett. She is keeping what your father left for you, not because he forgot, because he knew you would need it at the right time. Marvel read it once, then again, then a third time, moving her lips slightly on the words the way she had as a child when something seemed too important to trust to a single reading. Bertice Garnett. She turned the name over in her mind. Nothing came back. No face, no memory, no context, just the name itself sitting in her mother's handwriting on a piece of paper that had been waiting in this house for what might have been 30 years patient as the walls around it. Her father had left something for her. Her mother had known about it, and neither of them had told her while they were alive, which meant it was not something she was meant to find in the ordinary course of things. It was something she was meant to find precisely when she had nothing else left. She folded the paper and held it in her hand without putting it down. Outside, the temperature had dropped. She could feel it in the air moving under the door, cool and direct. Tallow had settled at her feet at some point, without her noticing, its body warm against her shoes, its breathing slow and even. She looked down at it. "I don't know yet," she said, though the dog had not asked her anything. She set the folded paper on the table propped against the candle holder where she would see it in the morning. Then she blew out one of the candles to conserve it, moved to the narrow room off the kitchen, where an old iron bed frame held a mattress she hoped was still serviceable, and laid down with her coat still buttoned. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house, adjusting to the cold, the creak of joists, the faint settling of old wood, the distant tapping of something loose on the roof. And she thought about her father, whom she had not allowed herself to think about for years, because grief at that distance has a way of arriving too completely if you open the door to it. Vernon Bledsoe had been a man of very few words and very deliberate actions. He had worked with his hands his entire life. He had not been wealthy or important or remarkable by the measures the world tends to use, but he had been a man who thought ahead, who prepared for things quietly and without announcement, because preparation in his view was its own reward, complete in itself without needing to be witnessed. He had left her something. He had arranged for it to be kept by someone she did not know, in a house she had not entered in 15 years, waiting for a moment that he had apparently believed would come. She did not know what it was, but she fell asleep thinking about a man who had spent his whole life making sure the boards fit together without gaps, and who had apparently applied that same precision to the problem of his daughter's future without ever saying a word about it to anyone who might have warned her in time. She was still holding the folded note when the gray morning came through the window. The second morning arrived with the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. Not urgent, measured. The footsteps of someone who had made this approach before and saw no need to announce himself from a distance. Marvell was standing at the kitchen sink, working the faucet handle through its reluctant routine until water came when she heard them. Tallow lifted its head from the floor, a single low sound, not quite a bark. Recognition, maybe, or something close to it. She looked out the window. The man standing at the edge of the yard was large and unhurried. 71 years had marked him without diminishing him, the way certain materials grow more reliable with use rather than less. His beard was gray and imperfectly kept. His hands were at his sides with the particular stillness of hands that were accustomed to holding tools and were simply resting between uses. There were traces of grease along the knuckles that soap had not fully removed, the kind that comes from decades of work on engines and machinery. He looked at the house the way a tradesman looks at a job, not judgmentally, but with the practiced assessment of someone who is already calculating what it would take. Then he looked at her. "Place like this doesn't fix itself," he said. It was not a greeting. It was a statement of fact delivered as an opening position. "I know," Marvel said through the window. He nodded once, as if that was the only answer he had needed. She went to the door and opened it. Up close, he moved without difficulty, his old hip injury incorporated into his stride so completely that it had become simply the way he walked rather than a limitation. The accommodation was decades old. "Leland Ashby," he said. "Marvell Bledsoe." He nodded again. His eyes moved to Tallow, who had come to stand beside Marvell in the doorway, with the quiet possessiveness of an animal that has selected its person. "That dog's been here a while," he said. "Apparently. Nobody's dog, but it stayed." He said it the way her mother had written things in the notebooks. Plainly, without the ornament of interpretation. Marvell looked at him. Someone was feeding it. He said nothing for a moment, then, "Your father fixed my truck engine in 1978. I was 25. He did it on a Saturday afternoon and wouldn't take a cent for it. Said neighbors don't charge neighbors." He paused. "I've been in the county ever since." It was the most he would say about why he was standing in her yard. She understood that it was also in its way everything. She stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." He looked at the house again, then at her. "I've got tools, real ones, when you're ready to start." He didn't come inside that day. That wasn't what the morning was for. He walked the exterior of the house, looked at the roof line, checked the foundation where it was visible, ran his hand along the window frames. He said little. When he had seen what he needed to see, he told her where to begin. "Start with what keeps out the weather," he said, "then what keeps in animals, then whatever's left." He left before noon. Marvell stood in the yard after he had gone and looked at the house with something that had not been there the day before. Not hope, esquarely, something more practical than hope. A sequence, a first step followed by a second laid out by a man who owed her nothing except the unpayable currency of a kindness her father had offered without keeping a ledger. She thought about the note in her coat pocket. Bertie Garnett. She would ask him, not today, but soon. She went inside and stood at the kitchen table, and for the first time since she had stepped off the bus, she looked at the seed packets not as objects she had found, but as objects she might actually use. She picked up two that still felt plausible and set them apart from the others. Then she put on her coat and went out to begin. She marked out her ground by walking it first. The south side of the house offered a narrow strip where the soil rests differently under her boots, less compacted, still holding a trace of warmth from the afternoon sun. She crouched and pulled a handful free, turned it in her fingers, pressed it the way she had watched her father press it when she was a child following him around a garden she had not yet learned to value. The ground could be worked. That first row took the better part of an afternoon. She used a short-handled spade she found leaning inside the back porch, its blade still sound, though the grip had dried and split along one side. Roots held. She worked around the ones she couldn't move and removed the ones she could. And when the light changed from gold to gray, she had a strip cleared that was roughly 4 feet wide and 12 feet long. It looked slight against the rest of the yard, almost apologetic, but it was the right size for what the seeds could fill. Tallow lay in the dry grass nearby throughout chin on paws, watching with the complete attention of a creature that has decided your work is worth witnessing. Part 2. The first thing that changed was the rhythm of the mornings. Not the work itself, which remained hard and slow and full of the small resistances that old property offers to anyone who tries to reclaim it, but the rhythm around the work shifted. Marvel began waking before the light arrived, lying still for a few minutes, in the iron bed, listening to Tallow breathe on the floor beside her, and then rising without deliberation, as if her body had decided to stop asking permission for the day. She worked the south side strip each morning before anything else demanded her attention, crouching and rising at the pace her knees permitted. By the end of the second week, the row held 3 plantings, dill and parsley from the seed tin, and a short line of winter greens she had put in on faith based on what the packet promised. The seeds had gone into the ground without ceremony. She had pressed each one into the prepared soil with her thumb and covered it without expectation, the way you mail a letter, without knowing whether it will be answered. Tallow supervised from the dry grass nearby, lying with its chin on its front paws, watching her with the patient attentiveness of an animal that has learned the value of simply being present. Leland returned on a Thursday with a hammer, whose handle was worn smooth from use, a coil of wire nails sorted into a coffee can, and a pair of work gloves 2 sizes too large for her hands. He set them on the porch without ceremony and said, "Start with the coop frame. I'll check the roof line." He did not ask how she was managing. He did not comment on what she had already done. He simply picked up where the previous visit had ended, as if the days between had been a pause in a conversation rather than an absence. They worked through the morning without much talk. Leland moved along the roof line with a deliberateness that acknowledged his age without being slowed by it. Marvel worked the lumber she had found stacked at the back of the property, sorting the pieces by soundness, setting aside what still had use, and stacking the rest for firewood. At some point, she stopped and asked him, "Do you know a woman named Bertice Garnett?" Leland did not answer immediately. He was on the low section of the roof, running his hand along a seam. He finished what he was doing before he looked down at her. 82 years old, he said, lives in Millhaven, 14 miles east on the county road. You know her. I know of her. She and your mother were close, from before you were born. He paused. She's still there. Same house she's been in since the 60s. Marvel waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. He turned back to the roof. She understood that Leland Ashby gave information in the exact amount required without excess. And she understood also that he either did not know what Bertice was keeping or had decided that was not his to say. Both possibilities told her something. She went to Millhaven on a Saturday driving the used truck that she had bought from a man 2 towns over for $800 and a firm handshake. The county road was straight and flat, cutting through farmland that had the tired, late-season look of fields that had given everything they had for the year and were now simply waiting for cold. Bertice Garnett's house sat back from the road behind a row of white oak trees that had been there long enough to develop real authority. The house itself was modest and well-kept white, with green shutters, a small porch with 2 chairs and a side table, a garden along the front that was being put to bed for winter, with the careful attention of someone who intended to use it again in spring. Marvell pulled into the gravel drive. The front door opened before she reached the porch steps. Bertice Garnett was 82 years old and had the specific kind of stillness that belongs to people who have been paying close attention to the world for a very long time and have learned that most things reveal themselves if you wait without fidgeting. Her hair was white and cut short. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, sharp and settled at once. Her hands trembled slightly at rest, but her voice when she spoke did not. "I wondered when you would come," she said. "Not I hoped, not I expected. Wondered." As if Marvell's arrival was something she had been curious about, its timing the only remaining variable. "I only found the note recently," Marvell said. Bertice nodded as if this confirmed something she had calculated. "Come in." The interior of the house was ordered with the precision of someone who had lived alone for a long time and had made a deliberate peace with that arrangement. Books on shelves sorted by subject. Photographs on one wall arranged chronologically rather than by sentiment. A kitchen table with 2 chairs, as if she had set it that morning for exactly this number of people. Bertice went to a cabinet in the corner of the front room and opened it without searching. She had clearly known exactly where this was kept. She brought a large envelope to the table, the paper yellowed and stiff at the edges, and set it down between them. "Your father gave this to me in 1973, she said. "He told me to keep it until Eustace said to give it to you, or until Eustace was gone and you came looking yourself." Marvell looked at the envelope. "What is it?" "Open it." Inside was a land deed, a formal document, the kind produced by a county registrar's office, with the raised seal still visible despite the years. The property was described in the legal language of survey coordinates and boundary descriptions, but the key facts were plain even to someone unfamiliar with deed language. 4.2 acres in Granger County, registered 1971, held in a family trust. Marvell Ann Bledsoe listed as sole beneficiary. Marvell read it through once without speaking. "He bought it over 10 years, Bertice said, saved what he could from every paycheck. He went out there himself to check the soil and the water before he signed anything. Walked the whole boundary on foot." She paused. "He didn't tell your mother until it was done. He just came home one evening and set the deed on the table and said, 'This is for Marvell when she needs somewhere to stand.'" The room was very quiet. Marvell thought about her father walking a boundary line in Granger County. She thought about him testing soil with his hands, the way he tested everything, not trusting conclusions he had not reached himself. She thought about him setting a deed on a kitchen table without drama and saying what he meant in 8 words. "Why didn't he give it to me directly?" she asked. Bertice looked at her with the patience of someone who has held a difficult truth for 50 years and has made their peace with its weight. "Because you were about to marry Garrison Tyndall, and your father had met Garrison Tyndall." Marvell was still. "He didn't say much about it," Bertice continued. "Your father never said much about anything he had decided, but he made this arrangement the same year you got engaged. He set it up so the trust couldn't be touched by any marriage agreement, no matter what happened later." The name arrived in Marvell's mind before she was ready for it. Granger County, the name that had not appeared in 28 pages of carefully prepared documents. The name she had noticed and not mentioned. The name that Warren Tolliver, with his expensive suit and his practiced calm and his company called Tolliver and Caldwell Development, had simply omitted. "Does anyone else know about this?" Marvell asked. Bertice considered the question carefully. "Your mother knew, I know, and I would think," she said, measuring the words, "that anyone who looked carefully at Granger County property records in the past several years would know there was a trust on that land with your name attached to it." Marvell drove back through the flat farmland with the envelope on the passenger seat in Granger County sitting in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings she was only beginning to see the edges of. The farmer's market was on Wednesdays and Saturdays in the parking lot of the old feed store on the county road, a collection of folding tables and truck tailgates that expanded and contracted with the season. Marvell had started bringing what the garden produced, small bundles of herbs tied with kitchen twine bags of greens that grew faster than she expected once the soil found its footing. She set up her table early before most of the other vendors because the mornings were when she thought most clearly, and she had come to prefer starting with her hands occupied. Most people passed without stopping. That was fine. She was not there to be noticed. She was there because the small transaction of growing something and offering it to someone who needed it had begun to feel like the most honest exchange she was capable of at this particular moment in her life. It was the third Saturday when Coleman Galloway stopped. He was 67 years old, broad through the chest, with the kind of hands that identified him immediately as a man who had spent his working life making things. Not maintaining them or managing them, but actually constructing them, joining material to material with skill and attention. He had stopped at her table twice before and looked at what she had without buying anything, which had annoyed her slightly less than she let herself admit. This time he picked up a bundle of dill, held it at a distance, examined it with the focused attention of a man looking for structural defects. "You planted these at the right spacing," he said. It was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was an assessment. "I made mistakes before I got it right," Marvel said. He nodded as if this was the answer that mattered. He set the bundle down, picked it up again, and put it in the small canvas bag he was carrying. He paid without haggling, which she appreciated more than she expected. "Coleman Galloway," he said. "Marvel Bledsoe." He looked at her for a moment with the direct, unhurried regard of someone accustomed to making evaluations that needed to be accurate. Then he moved on. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. He never lingered and he never said more than a few words, but there was something in his consistent return that Marvell recognized without being able to name precisely. He was a man who did not give his attention without reason, and he was choosing to give some portion of it to her table every week. She stored that fact away without drawing conclusions from it yet. Laverne Holloway's orders had settled into a weekly fixture by then. Every Thursday, Marvell brought herbs and eggs to the cafe, and Laverne received them with the brisk efficiency of a woman who ran a small business on narrow margins and knew the value of a reliable supplier. They had developed the specific warmth of two women who respect each other's competence without requiring the furniture of friendship to acknowledge it. The cafe itself was the kind of place that had been part of the county long enough to have opinions of its own. The counter ran the full length of the south wall. The stools had been reupholstered at some point, but not recently. The coffee was made in a machine old enough to have a specific personality, and Laverne knew its temperament as well as she knew anything else she worked with. One Thursday in late October, Laverne met her at the door instead of behind the counter. She pulled Marvell into the kitchen before she spoke. "Someone came in 2 days ago," Laverne said. Her voice had the careful evenness of a person managing something that had unsettled them. "A man in a suit. He said he represented a development company. He asked me if I knew you and whether I knew if you had any plans for a piece of land out in Granger County." The words landed with the specific weight of confirmation. Not surprise. Something worse than surprise. The feeling of a shape you already suspected becoming fully visible. "What did you tell him?" Marvell asked. "Nothing. I said I was just a customer supplier and didn't know anything about her personal business." Laverne paused. "But Marvell, they knew your name, your age, this address." Her eyes held steady. "They didn't come here to ask questions they didn't already know the answers to. They came to let you know they were asking." Marvell stood with the basket of herbs in her hands and felt something shift in the way the situation had been arranged in her mind. It was one thing to understand in the abstract that Warren Tolliver had omitted Granger County from a legal document. It was another thing to have a man in a suit appear in Laverne's kitchen asking questions by name. This was not an oversight being quietly ignored. This was an active campaign. "Thank you," Marvel said. "Be careful," Laverne said. And then, because she was Laverne Holloway and not a woman who left important things implied, whatever they want with that land, they want it badly enough to make house calls. Marvel walked back to her truck with the empty basket and sat in the cab for a moment before starting the engine. The morning was cold, the kind that settled into the joints and reminded you of every injury you had taken without quite healing. She put her hand over the envelope in her coat pocket. Still there, still hers. She drove home thinking about her father. Stellan and Selwyn Farlow came the following week. They had heard about Marvell through Laverne and through Leland in the way that information about people moves through small communities, not through announcement, but through the accumulation of separate mentions that eventually add up to a person. Stellan was 38, built with the particular density of a man who had been doing physical work since he was old enough to be useful, which in his family had been early. He assessed the house and property with quick, practical eyes, not unkindly, and spoke directly. Selwyn was smaller and quieter, her attention moving over the garden with a different quality of focus, the kind that comes from knowing how soil behaves over time rather than just in the moment. They did not ask what had brought Marvell here. They looked at what needed doing and began. Stellan went for the roofing tin that had been shifting since Marvell arrived, the loose section she had heard at night as a distant, irregular tapping. He worked with a speed that came from familiarity with the task, moving across the roof with confidence and economy. Leland arrived an hour later. He took in Stellan's approach to the coop corner they were reinforcing and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're going to use nail gun on that corner." Stellan looked up. "Faster." "Won't hold through winter," Leland said. "Needs mortise." Nail gun held on the Henderson place for 6 years. Henderson Place doesn't get the north wind this property gets. They looked at each other across the corner of the half-built coop with the particular tension of two people who are both right about different things and know it. Marvell had been working the garden bed 10 feet away. She straightened up, brushed the soil from her gloves, and looked at both of them. "Mortise," she said. Both men turned. "It's my coop," she said. "Mortise joints." Leland nodded once. Stellan set down the nail gun without comment and reached for the hand tools. They went back to work. It was the first time in this new life that Marvell had made a decision in front of other people and had it simply accepted without negotiation. The simplicity of it was striking. She turned back to the garden bed and pressed the next set of seeds into the prepared earth without thinking about it further. But something in her posture had changed. She was standing straighter than she had been when the morning started. Selwyn crouched beside her. "You've got the spacing right on these," she said, looking at the rows. "A lot of people crowd them." "I made that mistake first," Marvel said. Selwyn reached into the bag she had brought. "Beans and some winter greens. You don't have to plant all of it, just enough to have something coming up when the other rows thin out." She set the packets on the edge of the cleared bed and went back to where she had been checking the soil composition along the fence line, pressing a handful of earth between her fingers and studying its texture with the concentration of someone reading a document. That afternoon, while Stellan finished the roof work and Leland reinforced the far coop wall, Marvell walked the perimeter of the property alone. She had not done this since arriving, had not given herself the particular information that only comes from moving the full boundary of a place under your own feet. The property was not large, but it held something she had not expected. The back corner where the fence met the old oak line had a specific quality of quiet that was different from the rest of the yard. The trees there were older, their canopy thicker, the ground beneath them soft with accumulated seasons. She stood in it for a few minutes without doing anything. Then she went back to work. The cold came on a Tuesday night without adequate warning. Marvell felt it before she was fully awake, the specific quality of air that had turned beyond autumn into something with actual consequences. She dressed quickly and went outside. The sky was clear and hard above her, the kind of clarity that means the temperature has nowhere to hide. The ground was stiff. Frost had settled across the yard in a thin white layer that made everything look preserved, as if the night had tried to make a museum of the property. She moved toward the coop. She knew before she reached it. She knew from the silence. Chickens are not quiet animals even in the early morning. When she opened the coop door, the 2 hens she had managed to acquire a week earlier were still and cold on the floor. She had not insulated the structure adequately. She had known it was not quite right, but had believed it would hold through a few more nights. She had been wrong about that, and the wrongness had a cost that was lying in front of her now. She stood with one hand on the coop frame and let herself stay with it, not with guilt, which would have been self-indulgent, not with despair, which would have been excessive, just with the plain fact of having made an insufficient preparation in a situation where insufficient was not adequate, and with the understanding that this would not be the last time something in this new life would ask more of her than she had given it. The fall happened later that same morning. She was reattaching a section of wire along the coop's outer frame, working more quickly than her usual pace, because the cold made her want to be done and inside. Her right foot found a patch of mud hidden under the frost, and the correction she made was half a second too late. The ground arrived against her left side with a bluntness that knocked the breath out of her and sent a spike of pain through her ribs that she felt in her back teeth. Tallow barked once, then circled her without touching her, which was the correct response and the one she was most grateful for. She lay still for the time it took to understand the scope of what had happened, which was not catastrophic, but was not nothing either. She got up by herself, slowly with one hand on the coop frame. Her face had gone the color of old chalk. The days that followed had a new arithmetic to them. Every movement had a cost she had to calculate in advance. Bending and reaching, rising from a chair, all of it ran through the same hesitation, the same internal negotiation between what needed doing and what doing it would require. The savings she had brought with her, never substantial, contracted visibly. Flour lamp oil feed for tallow, 2 items from the hardware supply in town. Each purchase appeared in her mind as a number she could not stop subtracting from. One evening, she did not light the candle when darkness came. She sat at the kitchen table in the gray light that came through the window and did not move for a long time. Tallow was at her feet, his slow breathing the only sound in the room. She was not crying, she was not praying. She was simply sitting with the full weight of the situation without trying to manage it or resolve it or narrate it into something more bearable than it was. The question that came was not dramatic. It arrived quietly, almost gently, the way the most difficult questions always arrive. She was 73 years old with cracked ribs and dwindling money and a property that needed more than she had been able to give it. She could stop. She could make a phone call in the morning, and by the following week, she would be somewhere with heating and meals provided and people paid to help her. The question sat there. She did not answer it. She sat with it until it had nothing left to add, and then she reached forward and lit the candle. Not because the question was gone, because the mending was on the table and the mending needed light and the mending was going to get done. She was still working 2 hours later when Tallow lifted his head sharply from the floor. A moment later, her phone rang. She did not recognize the number, but she answered it because Leland had told her about several local numbers she should expect, and she had been storing them. It was Bertice Garnett. Her voice was measured, but there was something underneath it that Marvell had not heard at their first meeting. A careful quality, not fear exactly, the sound of a person choosing each word with more attention than usual. "Someone came to see me yesterday," Bertice said. "He said he was a relative of yours. He asked whether I knew what property you had inherited from your father." Marvell was very still. "He described himself as a family member who was concerned about your welfare," Bertice continued. "He was well-dressed. He spoke politely. He asked 3 questions and did not like any of the answers I gave him, which were that I was an old woman and didn't keep track of other people's legal matters." "How old was he?" Marvell asked. "Middle 40s, dark hair. He had the look of a man who expected to be taken seriously." "Jasper Tyndall." "Thank you, Bertice," Marvell said. "He'll come back," Bertice said simply. "People like that always come back when they don't get what they want the first time. You should know that and plans accordingly." The call ended. Marvell sat with her hand on the phone for a moment, then set it on the table beside the candle. Jasper Tyndall had driven to Millhaven, had found Bertice Garnett, had presented himself as a concerned family member, which meant that someone had told him where to look, which meant that someone had been looking. She thought about Warren Tolliver. She thought about Tolliver and Caldwell Development and a proposed road through Granger County. She thought about a man who had omitted 4.2 acres from 28 pages of carefully prepared documents and had done it without any sign of carelessness. Then she thought about something Leland had said on his 3rd visit, almost in passing, the way Leland said everything he considered important, as if importance were something he did not want to be caught performing. He had been replacing a board on the porch when he said it, not looking at her, just working and talking the way he did when the words came as a side effect of the task. "Tolliver family's been in this county a long time," he had said. "Warren's father had a talent for land, found ways to acquire it from people who didn't know what they had until it was gone. He set a nail and drove it. Warren learned the business young." Marvell had been holding a board at the time, and she had held it steadier than she felt. "Your father knew the Tolliver family," Leland had added, "knew what they did and how they did it." A pause. "I always figured that's why he was so particular about how he set things up." He hadn't said anything more. He didn't need to. Vernon Bledsoe had not just loved his daughter. He had thought ahead. He had looked at the landscape of his county, identified the specific kind of risk that existed in it, and built a legal structure designed to withstand exactly that risk. He had done it quietly without telling anyone who might inadvertently let the wrong person know, and he had kept it intact for 50 years through the simple method of entrusting it only to people he was certain of. And now Jasper Tyndall had gone looking for Bertice Garnett, which meant that someone almost certainly Warren Tolliver had figured out that the trust existed, had gone looking for the person who held it, and had sent someone to find out how much Marvell knew. Marvell blew out the candle and sat in the dark for just a moment. Then she lit it again, pulled the envelope from the shelf where she had kept it since returning from Millhaven, and sat down to read the deed one more time. Not because she needed to, because she wanted the specifics of it clear in her mind before the next step, whatever the next step was going to be. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the trees at the edge of the property with a low sound that the house received without complaint. Tallow shifted on the floor, pressed his side against her foot, and went still again. She read the deed until she had memorized it. Then she folded it, returned it to the envelope, and put it in her coat pocket, where she would know exactly where it was at every moment from this point forward. Part 3. 3 weeks after Bertice's phone call, Leland came by on a morning when the sky was the hard, bright blue of a day that means business, and he brought 3 young hens in a wooden crate without mentioning the ones that had died. He set the crate down outside the coop, which Stellan had reinforced with mortise joints, and Leland had inspected without complimenting, and he opened the latch. The birds stepped out onto the cold ground with the alert, self-important manner of hens that have not yet learned humility. Man down the road was thinning his flock, Leland said. He did not say he had gone looking. He did not say he had paid for them. Though she understood, both things were true. He picked up the hammer he had left on the porch on his previous visit and went to work on the sideboards of the coop that still needed attention, and Marvell stood watching the hens investigate their new territory with the focused curiosity of creatures entirely unconcerned with the circumstances that had brought them here. Tella watched them from a careful distance. He had learned from the previous birds that hens had opinions about dogs who came too close, and he had filed that information away without needing to revisit it. Leland, Marvel said. He kept working. Thank you. He drove a nail and moved to the next board. Weather's supposed to hold another 2 weeks, he said. Use the time. Later that morning, Stellan arrived with a load of scrap lumber his truck had apparently been carrying for no other purpose. He and Leland worked alongside each other with the particular efficiency of 2 men who had resolved their differences about methodology and moved on without requiring the resolution to be acknowledged. The coop took shape over the course of the day, solid and square, and prepared for whatever the season intended to send. Marvell planted the bean seeds Selwyn had left. She worked the rows carefully, measuring the spacing by eye now, rather than by instrument, her hands having learned what they needed to learn through the mistakes she had made in the early weeks. The earth had softened slightly with the recent moisture, more cooperative than it had been, and the work had a different quality to it than it had in the beginning. Less like argument, more like conversation. Coleman Galloway appeared at the edge of the property in the early afternoon. He had not been expected. He walked from the road with his hands at his sides and stopped at the fence line, looking at the property with focused, unhurried assessment. Marvel straightened from the garden bed and looked at him. Heard you had some trouble, he said. Some, she said. He looked at the coop, then at the garden, then at the house. He was doing arithmetic of some kind, she understood that. Evaluating something. Road they're planning, he said. The one Tolliver and Caldwell is pushing through county. You know it goes across 4 other properties after Granger County. Marvell did not know this. She kept her expression level. Tell me. Coleman came through the fence gate, which she had not explicitly offered but did not object to, and stood in the yard with the ease of a man who does not enter spaces. He is not welcome in and has learned to read the difference accurately. Henderson Farm is 1, Kowalski property on the east side, the Marsh family land that the widows have been trying to hold on to for 8 years. He paused. They've been working on those families for 2 years. Making offers, applying pressure, letting things drag through county permitting until people get tired and sell. He looked at her directly. Your piece at Granger County is the anchor point. Without it, the road alignment doesn't work. They need it to go through first, and then the rest follows. Marvel thought about Vernon Bledsoe walking a boundary line in 1971, testing soil, testing water, choosing this particular piece of ground. He knew, she said mostly to herself. Ma'am, my father. He knew this land would matter. She looked at the deed-shaped rectangle in her coat pocket, visible as a slight stiffness in the fabric. He didn't know exactly how, but he knew it would matter to someone who shouldn't have it. Coleman was quiet for a moment. There's a meeting at the county planning office in 3 weeks, he said. Public comment period on the road project. If someone with a legal claim to property in the affected corridor shows up with documentation, it changes the conversation considerably. He said it plainly without pressure, the way he said everything. I'll be there, Marvel said. He nodded once and moved back toward the fence. At the gate, he stopped. I built the framing on the Kowalski house in 1987, he said. Good family. Worked hard for that land. He looked back at her. So did yours. He left without waiting for a response, which she appreciated. She had enough to think about. That evening, she called Solange Fentress. She had found Solange's name through Laverne, who had described her as a young woman who had left a corporate firm in the city to open a two-room office in Millhaven, because as Laverne put it, she wanted to actually practice law rather than manage billing cycles. Her office was above a hardware store. Her business card had her cell number on it and nothing else decorative. Solange answered on the second ring. Marvell described the situation without embellishment. The trust, the deed, the omission from the divorce documents, the Tolliver and Caldwell Road project, Jasper's visit to Bertice, the man who had appeared at Laverne's cafe with questions he already knew the answers to. Solange listened without interrupting, which Marvell found immediately reassuring. People who interrupt early are people who are listening for the parts that confirm what they already think. Solange was listening for the parts she had not yet anticipated. When Marvell finished, there was a brief silence. "Can you bring me the original deed and whatever documentation Bertice Garnett has?" Solange asked. "Yes." "How are you fixed for time on Thursday?" "I'll be there," Marvell said. She drove to Millhaven on Thursday with the envelope in the interior pocket of her coat, close enough to her body that she could feel it with every breath. Solange Fentress was 39 years old, with the kind of focused energy that comes not from youth, but from having made a decision about what her work was for and being at peace with the cost of that decision. Her office was small and efficiently arranged. She read every page of the trust documentation with the same unhurried thoroughness that Marvell had applied to the divorce papers in Tolliver's conference room, moving through each section without rushing, making occasional small marks in the margins with a pencil. When she finished, she set the documents on the desk and looked at Marvell. "The trust is valid and has never been dissolved," she said. "Your name as sole beneficiary has been on record at the county registrar since 1971. That's the foundation everything else rests on." She paused. "And no prenuptial agreement formed after this trust creation can affect assets held within it. That's settled law." "Tolliver would know that," Marvell said. "Any competent real estate attorney would know that," Solange said. "Which means the omission from your divorce documents was not an oversight." The room was quiet for a moment. "He was acting as Garrison's attorney," Solange said carefully. "But he also had a direct financial interest in the Granger County corridor through his development company. Those two things create a conflict that the Bar Association would find very interesting." "Can you prove he knew about the trust before he prepared the documents?" Solange turned a page in the file she had assembled. "His development company retained a property survey firm in Granger County 14 months before your divorce was finalized. That survey covered the entire proposed road corridor, including the boundary of your trust's acreage. The survey firm's work product is a matter of public record." She looked up. "They mapped your land." He billed the survey to Tolliver and Caldwell Development. Then 14 months later, he prepared divorce documents that did not mention that land. Marvell absorbed this. "I want to file a motion," Solange said, "to have the divorce settlement reviewed on grounds of material misrepresentation of marital assets. It won't give you the house back, and it won't result in criminal charges against Tolliver, because the gap between what he knew and what we can prove he deliberately concealed is one a good defense attorney could argue in front of a jury." She paused. "But it will put everything on the public record. Every document, every date, every connection between his legal work for your husband and his financial interest in your father's land." "And the road project?" Marvell asked. "If you appear at the county planning meeting with documented ownership of that acreage, and if it becomes publicly known at the same time that the attorney who advised on the road corridor's legal feasibility had previously handled a divorce proceeding in which that same acreage was omitted, the planning board has a serious problem." Solange said it evenly, without relish, as a person states a logical sequence. "Projects like this rely on clean paperwork. This paperwork is not clean." Marvell sat with the full weight of this for a moment. She thought about Warren Tolliver in his conference room with his expensive suit and his practiced calm, glancing at his watch while she read. She thought about him believing she would not read carefully enough, or that even if she noticed an absence, she would not know what she was looking at. She thought about her father in 1971, walking a boundary line, testing soil signing papers with a deliberateness that was not about wealth or ambition, but about a specific and practical form of love, the kind that prepares for what it cannot predict and trusts that the preparation will arrive when it is needed. "File it," Marvell said. She drove to Warren Tolliver's office the following Monday. She had not called ahead. She wore the gray wool coat she had worn out of Garrison's house on the morning she left, which was not a statement so much as a fact. It was the coat she owned, and it was warm, and she had nowhere to store the weight of other people's symbolism. The receptionist at Tolliver and Caldwell Development was a young woman who assessed Marvell's arrival with the trained pleasantness of someone whose job included making unscheduled visitors feel they had made an error in judgment. "I don't have an appointment," Marvell said before the woman could ask. "But Mr. Tolliver will want to see me. Tell him Marvell Bledsoe is here about the Granger County Trust." She sat in the reception area and waited. She did not have to wait long. Warren Tolliver came through the interior door 7 minutes later. He was dressed in the same register as she remembered, controlled and expensive, and arranged for maximum legibility as a person of consequence. But there was something different in his eyes. Not fear, not quite. The look of a man who has just confirmed a piece of information he had been hoping would remain unconfirmed. He led her to his office without speaking in the hallway. When the door closed, he took his chair and looked at her with the careful blankness of a man who has had difficult conversations before and knows not to lead with what he actually thinks. "Mrs. Bledsoe," he said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she said. "That was intentional." She did not open her coat or produce any documents. She had decided on the drive over that she would not do that. The documents were not the point of this visit. "I want you to know 3 things," she said. "First, I know the trust exists and that my name has been on it since before my marriage to Garrison. Second, I know you knew that before you prepared the divorce settlement. And third, I know that your survey company mapped that acreage 14 months before the settlement was filed." Tolliver said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing. It was probably his most valuable professional skill. "My attorney is filing a motion on Thursday," Marvell said. "Everything I have just told you will be on public record by the end of next week. The planning board will receive a copy." She stood. "I am not here to negotiate," she said. "I am here so that you cannot later say you were surprised." She buttoned her coat and left. In the elevator going down, she felt her hands were not entirely steady, which was fine. Steady hands were for people who had not just done something that required courage. The unsteadiness was simply evidence that she had understood the weight of what she was doing and had done it anyway. Her phone rang as she reached the parking lot. "Jasper Tyndall." She answered. "I heard you went to see Warren today." His voice had lost the controlled quality she remembered from the attorney's office. It had the tight, pressurized sound of a man trying to manage something that was moving faster than he could keep up with. "You heard correctly," she said. "You don't understand what you're starting," he said. "Warren has resources you can't match. He will tie this up in court for years. You're 73 years old. You don't have years to spend on this." Marvell stood in the parking lot of Tolliver and Caldwell Development in the cold November air and looked at the building she had just walked out of. "Jasper," she said. She said it the way you say a word when you want the person hearing it to feel the full weight of being identified. "I spent 50 years being managed by people who thought they understood my limitations better than I did. Your father did it quietly. You do it loudly. The result is the same either way." She paused. "I'm done with the result." She ended the call before he could respond. She drove home through the flat county roads with both hands on the wheel and the heat running and the envelope still inside her coat where it had been since Thursday. When she pulled into the gravel drive, Tala was waiting on the porch steps, which he had taken to doing in the late afternoons, positioned there, as if he had appointed himself the official greeter of returning persons. She sat in the truck for a moment before going in. The planning meeting was in 2 weeks. Solange's motion would be filed in 3 days. Everything was in motion now, moving in one direction, and the only question remaining was whether it would arrive at the right place before someone found a way to slow it. She got out of the truck, scratched tallow briefly behind the uneven ear, and went inside. She had dinner to make and seeds to check on and a letter from Solange to read before morning. The oil lamp on the kitchen table cast a steady circle of light across the room. She hung her coat, felt the weight of the envelope in the pocket as she did, and left it there rather than moving it. Close was close enough. Outside, the first real cold of winter was settling across the county, and the garden beds she had prepared were under it, waiting as prepared things wait for the season to turn again. She was not afraid. She had been afraid in the attorney's office signing papers while Warren Tolliver checked his watch. She had been afraid in the dark the night she chose not to light the candle immediately. She had been afraid on the ground beside the coop, with her ribs sending fire through her side, and tallow circling, and the full arithmetic of her situation pressing down without mercy. But she was not afraid now. She knew what she had, she knew who had prepared it for her, and she knew with the particular clarity that only comes after a long time of not knowing exactly what she intended to do with it. The motion was filed on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon the county seat knew about it. That was the nature of small jurisdictions. Documents became public record at the moment of filing, and public records had readers and readers had phones. And by the time Marvell drove home from Millhaven that evening, Laverne Holloway had already received 2 calls from people asking whether she knew what was happening with the woman who sold herbs at the Wednesday market. Laverne called Marvell instead of answering them. "People are paying attention," Laverne said. "Good," Marvell said. She had not set out to become a story. She had set out to protect what her father had built and to ensure that 4 other families did not lose their land to a road project predicated on documents that had been prepared with a conflict of interest baked into their foundation. But stories attach themselves to situations whether or not the people inside them invite them, and Marvell had lived long enough to understand that the attachment was neither good nor bad in itself. What mattered was whether the story was accurate. This one was. Solange had filed 47 pages of documentation with the motion. Survey records, billing records from Tolliver and Caldwell Development showing the property assessment commissioned 14 months before the divorce settlement. A timeline that placed Warren Tolliver in possession of specific knowledge about the Granger County Trust at the same time he was preparing legal documents that omitted it. The motion did not allege criminal conduct. It alleged material misrepresentation in a civil proceeding, which was also, Solange had explained, a much harder claim to argue against in a county where everyone knew everyone and the filing was going to be read by the same neighbors who had watched Tolliver and Caldwell apply pressure to the Henderson farm and the Kowalski property for 2 years. Marvell drove to Granger County on the Saturday before the planning meeting. She had been once before briefly on the afternoon after Solange confirmed the trust's validity. But that first visit had been about orientation, about standing on the land and understanding its dimensions. This visit was different. She brought the deed, she brought a notebook, and she walked the full boundary of the 4.2 acres on foot the way Vernon Bledsoe had walked it in 1971. Not because she needed to confirm what the survey said, but because she needed to know the land with her body rather than just with her mind. The ground was cold and firm beneath her boots. The grass had gone dormant, pale, and flattened by the season. At the north edge, a shallow creek ran through a cut in the earth, narrow enough to step across but persistent, moving with the specific quiet urgency of water that has been finding this path for a long time and sees no reason to change. At the south edge, where the proposed road alignment would enter the land, rose slightly into a low ridge that caught the morning light at an angle that made the frost on the ground visible as individual crystals rather than a general white. Her father had stood here. He had looked at what she was looking at. He had decided it was worth 10 years of careful saving. She stood on the ridge for a while without moving. In the far corner, a single sycamore tree rose alone, broader than any tree has a right to be when it stands by itself. The bark was white and peeling in the specific pattern of old sycamores, revealing the pale, smooth inner wood beneath. At shoulder height, an old blaze mark had healed over entirely the scar absorbed into the trunk over decades until it was nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. Someone had made that mark deliberately. Someone had wanted to know this tree again. Marvell put her hand on the healed scar. She stood there for a long time, feeling the cold of the bark against her palm, thinking about a man who had walked this ground 50 years ago with a blade, and a reason who had marked this tree not for himself, but for whoever came after him. Then she opened her notebook and began writing down what she saw. The night before the planning meeting, Coleman Galloway knocked on her door. She had not expected him. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, which was a gesture she had not seen from him before and which told her something about the weight he was carrying. "Henderson called me today," he said when she opened the door. "And the Kowalski family and Margaret Marsh." He paused. "They want to know if they can come to the meeting. Stand in the room while you speak." Marvell looked at him for a moment. "It's a public meeting," she said. "Yes," he said, "but they wanted to know if you'd mind." She understood what he was really asking. Whether she wanted witnesses or whether she wanted to handle this alone. Whether she was the kind of person who drew strength from company or the kind who needed to be solitary to be effective. Tell them to come, she said. Coleman nodded. He put his hat back on. He started to turn, then stopped. I built the original barn framing on the Henderson place, he said. 1989. Took 3 weeks. Best framing job I ever did. He looked at her. I'd like to see that family keep their land. So would I, Marvel said. He left, and she stood in the doorway until his truck's taillights had turned onto the county road and disappeared. And then she went back to the kitchen table where she had been going over her notes for the next morning. The county planning office occupied a low brick building adjacent to the courthouse, its meeting room designed for the practical business of permits and variances rather than the dramatic. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs arranged in rows, a long table at the front for the 5-member planning board, a podium with a microphone that had a slight feedback issue when you stood too close to it. Marvell arrived early. She sat in the second row and watched the room fill. Solange Fentress took the seat beside her, her briefcase on the floor, her expression carrying the focused calm of someone who had prepared thoroughly and was now content to let the preparation do its work. Leland came in and sat one row behind without announcement. Laverne arrived and sat beside him. Stellan and Selwyn took the end of the same row. Coleman came in with 3 other groups she did not recognize but understood immediately. A man and woman in their 60s with the weathered, self-possessed look of people who had farmed the same land for a generation. A younger woman with 2 teenagers who sat with the particular stillness of young people who have been told this matters and have decided to believe it. An older man alone, white-haired, who moved to a chair near the aisle and sat with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes directed steadily forward. Margaret Marsh, Marvell understood. The Henderson family, the Kowalskis. They did not speak to her. They did not need to. Their presence in the room was its own form of language. Warren Tolliver arrived with 2 attorneys. He sat on the far side of the room away from the families and arranged his papers on the chair beside him with the methodical precision of a man who has learned to keep his hands occupied when his mind is working. He did not look at Marvell. That was information. Jasper Tyndall was not present. That was also information. The planning board chair called the meeting to order. He was a man in his late 50s named Robert Calder, a 3rd-generation county resident who had the particular gravity of someone who has held local authority long enough to understand both its weight and its limits. He read through the agenda items in order, his voice, even his manner, suggesting he had read the motion Solange filed and had formed opinions about it that he intended to keep off his face until the appropriate moment. The road project came up 40 minutes into the meeting following 2 variance requests and a drainage permit. Calder summarized the project and its current status, noting that a motion had been filed in civil court 3 days prior, raising questions about the legal basis of certain property assessments underlying the project's planning documentation. He stated this without editorial comment. He noted that public comment was open on the road project and invited those who wished to speak to approach the podium. 3 of Tolliver's representatives spoke first. They described the project in the language of economic development and infrastructure improvement, using phrases that had been assembled to carry maximum plausibility with minimum specific content. The road would create jobs. It would connect underserved areas to commercial corridors. It had been planned responsibly and in accordance with all applicable regulations. Marvell listened. She had spent 50 years listening to the version of events that benefited other people. She had learned to hear what was not being said alongside what was. When it was her turn, she walked to the podium and set her notebook on the surface and looked at the 5 members of the planning board without hurrying. "My name is Marvell Bledsoe," she said. "I am the sole beneficiary and legal owner of a 4.2-acre parcel in Granger County that is located within the proposed road corridor. My ownership is documented in a family trust established in 1971, properly filed with this county's registrar, and unaffected by any subsequent legal proceeding." She paused to let that settle. "The attorney who prepared my divorce settlement last year is the co-founder of the development company proposing this road. His company commissioned a property survey of the Granger County corridor, including my acreage 14 months before that settlement was finalized. My property was not disclosed in the settlement documents." She paused again. "Those facts are now part of the public court record. I am not asking this board to resolve a civil matter. I am asking this board to consider whether a project whose legal feasibility was assessed by an attorney who had an undisclosed financial interest in the outcome of a related legal proceeding represents the kind of clean foundation on which a responsible planning decision should rest. The room was very quiet. She could hear the fluorescent lights humming. "The family's in this room," she said, and she did not gesture because she did not need to. The Hendersons, the Kowalski. Margaret Marsh had been managing pressure from this project for 2 years. They have been made offers designed to feel inevitable. They have been told the road is coming regardless. What they were not told was that the determination of its legal feasibility was made by someone with a direct financial interest in that determination going one particular way. She looked at Robert Calder. "I am asking for a suspension of the planning process pending independent review of the project's legal documentation. I have my attorney here to answer procedural questions." She picked up her notebook. "That is all I have to say." She walked back to her seat. The room remained quiet for a moment that stretched several seconds longer than silence usually lasts in public meetings. Then it broke into the specific kind of controlled noise that happens when people want to speak but are not yet sure whether speaking is the thing to do. Warren Tolliver did not speak. One of his attorneys approached the podium and offered a prepared response about the appropriateness of raising civil litigation matters in a planning context which was technically reasonable and entirely beside the point, and which the room received with the specific quality of attention given to a person who is saying something careful but not something true. Robert Calder conferred with the other board members for 4 minutes. Then he announced that given the documentation placed in public record earlier in the week, the board was suspending the road project from active consideration pending a review of the legal basis of the planning documentation by independent county counsel. The motion passed 4-1. Tolliver left before the meeting was formally closed. Marvell watched him go without satisfaction and without disappointment. She felt something quieter than either of those things. The feeling of a weight she had been carrying for reasons she had not fully understood until recently, a weight that was not really about Warren Tolliver or Garrison or Jasper or the divorce, but about the longer question of whether her father's preparation had been worth what it cost him being set down in the right place at last. It had been. Outside in the cold air of the parking lot, Margaret Marsh found her. She was in her late 60s, white-haired with the direct eyes of someone who had been dealing with difficulty without flinching for long enough that it no longer required effort. She took Marvell's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment without speaking. "My husband built that barn," she finally said, "before he died. He made me promise not to sell." "You didn't," Marvell said. Margaret nodded once. Her eyes were bright but did not spill. "Not yet," she said. She pressed Marvell's hand and let go. Coleman Galloway was waiting beside Marvell's truck. He said nothing when she approached, just looked at her with the evaluating attention she had come to recognize as his particular form of respect. "Henderson said to tell you thank you," he said. Said he couldn't make himself say it in there without getting emotional in front of people. "Tell him I understand," Marvell said. Coleman opened her truck door for her, which she had not expected, and which she accepted without comment because it was offered without condescension, as one person of a certain age offering a courtesy to another person of a certain age, simple and unloaded. She drove home through the county roads in the gray afternoon light, both hands on the wheel, the deed still in her coat pocket. Garrison's car was in her gravel drive when she arrived. She had not seen it coming, not literally, not figuratively. She sat in her truck for a moment looking at the familiar shape of the vehicle and the man sitting in it, and she understood that this was the thing she had been not thinking about through the weeks of legal preparation and market mornings and garden work and all the other forward-facing activities she had arranged her days around. Garrison got out when he saw her truck. He was thinner than she remembered. Not dramatically, but in the specific way of a man whose body has been reflecting a year of difficulty back at him without his consent. His coat was the dark green one he had worn for 15 years, which meant he was still wearing old things rather than replacing them, which meant some part of him was still operating by the old economies, even without her there to shop for him. His hair had gone further into gray. His posture was still upright, but had lost the particular quality of uprightness that had always been about showing something. He was just standing straight now, because that was how he stood. "I heard about the meeting," he said. "It was this morning," she said. "I know." He looked at the house, then back at her. "I've been sitting here an hour trying to figure out what I came to say." She waited. He had always needed more time than she did to arrive at the thing he actually meant. She had learned that in the first year of their marriage and had spent the following 49 either accommodating it or resenting it, depending on what else was happening at the time. Standing in her own gravel drive, she found she had no particular feeling about it either way. It was simply a fact about him, like the green coat. I knew Warren handled things, Garrison said. I knew he was aggressive. I told myself that was what you needed, someone who knew how to make things efficient. He stopped. I didn't ask what efficient meant in this case. I didn't ask what he was leaving out. Did you know about my father's land? She asked. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has come to say something honest and has committed to that fully. No, he said. I didn't know it existed. Warren handled all the property work. I signed what he put in front of me. He paused. I understand that's its own kind of failure. The admission sat between them in the cold air. Marvell looked at the man she had been married to for 50 years. She looked at the way he was standing in her gravel drive with his hat in his hands, which was something she had never seen from him in all the years she had known him, and she understood that what he had come to offer her was not an explanation. He had come because at whatever point in this past year he had arrived at the recognition of what he had done, he had decided that she deserved to hear it from him directly rather than to simply live with its absence. Garrison, she said, I spent a long time wanting to understand why things changed, why you became someone I didn't recognize. She let that sit for a moment. I don't need that anymore. He looked at her. I'm not saying that to wound you, she said. I'm saying it because it's true. The question doesn't live in me the way it used to. There isn't space for it. He looked past her at the house, at the garden beds visible around the side, at the solid shape of the coop in the back, at the careful built-up evidence of a life that had been assembled from nothing over the course of a single year by a woman who had not asked anyone's permission to begin. I'm glad, he said quietly, that you found something here. I didn't find it, she said. I built it. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked to his car and opened the door and then stopped with one hand on the roof. Your father was a good man, he said. He said it the way people say things they should have said much earlier and have finally run out of reasons not to. Better than I gave him credit for. He got into the car. He drove out of the gravel drive and onto the county road and did not stop. Marvell stood where she was until the sound of his engine had faded into the general quiet of the afternoon. Tallow came around the corner of the house and sat beside her, leaning his weight against her leg, in the way he had developed over the months, not demanding anything, just present. She put her hand on his head. Then she went inside. The kitchen was as she had left it that morning. The notebook on the table, the lamp unlit, the coat hooks by the door holding the assortment of practical outerwear that a year of outdoor work had made necessary. She hung her coat, feeling the weight of the envelope leave her as she settled it on the hook. And she stood for a moment in the kitchen that had been her mother's kitchen and was now hers, with the particular quality of silence that follows the resolution of something that has been unresolved for a very long time. She lit the lamp. She put water on for tea. She sat down at the table and looked at the notebook, open to the notes she had made walking the Granger County boundary. The sketches of the creek and the ridge, the sycamore tree, the healed scar where her father had made his mark. She thought about Vernon Bledsoe notching that bark 50 years ago, marking something he had bought with 10 years of saved wages, marking it for a daughter he could not yet know would need it. She thought about Eustace writing things down every day, not to create a record, but because each day was worth the attention of being recorded. She thought about Bertice Garnett keeping an envelope for half a century in a cabinet she never had to search. She thought about Leland Ashby driving nails into a coop without needing to be asked, and Laverne Holloway buying herbs without bargaining, and Stellan setting down a nail gun without argument, and Selwyn pressing seeds into her hands with the instruction that she didn't have to plant all of it. She thought about Coleman Galloway standing at the fence line telling her that the land mattered to more people than just her, and about Margaret Marsh pressing her hand in a parking lot, and about the Henderson man who couldn't say thank you in a public room without his voice breaking. The water boiled. She made the tea. She brought it to the table and sat with her hands wrapped around the mug, feeling the warmth move through her palms, and she looked out the window at the last gray light settling across the garden, where the wintergreens were holding cold but persistent, doing exactly what they were made to do. The trust would go through the full court review process, which Solange estimated would take several months. The planning board's suspension of the road project was not permanent, but the independent review it had ordered would take time, and time had a way of changing the conditions around a project enough that what had seemed inevitable in October could look considerably less so by spring. Coleman had told her that the Henderson family was talking to a land attorney of their own. Margaret Marsh had found documents her husband had kept about the offers Tolliver and Caldwell had made over the years, documents that her husband had considered important enough to store separately from his other papers. Things were in motion, not all of them in her hands, not all of them within her control. That was fine. She had learned over the course of this year the specific distinction between what belonged to her and what did not. The land was hers. The trust was hers. The garden she had cleared row by row from resistant ground was hers. The friendships that had formed without announcement through the repeated ordinary acts of people showing up were hers in the way that only earned things are yours, not because you claim them, but because you were present for their becoming. What was not hers was the guarantee. She had stopped needing the guarantee somewhere around the third week of October on a morning when she had gone out to check the garden before dawn and found the first green shoots pushing through the soil she had prepared thin and pale and absolutely committed to their own direction, and had understood that she had done the work and the work had responded, and that this was in the end the only contract that had ever been available to anyone. She finished the tea. She rinsed the mug and set it on the shelf. Tallow had come inside and was lying by the door in the position he had claimed as his, close enough to hear the approach of visitors, far enough from the drafts that came under the frame in the cold weather. His breathing was the slow, reliable sound of an animal that had made its decision about where it belonged and was at peace with having made it. Tomorrow she would go to the market. She had beans to bring and the last of the fall herbs and 4 dozen eggs from the hens that were laying steadily now, 2 more than she needed for the week. Laverne had asked if she could increase the Thursday order, which meant planning ahead for what the garden would need to produce through the winter months, which meant conversations with Selwyn about cold frames and soil preparation, which meant more mornings of the kind that had become the rhythm of her days here. She turned off the lamp. The room went dark in the way of rooms with windows, not completely, not empty, just resting. A stripe of pale moonlight lay across the kitchen floor, reaching from the window to the table leg, steady and unhurried. Marvell stood in it for a moment. She was not the woman who had stood on Garrison's porch with her hand on a railing she was saying goodbye to. She was not the woman who had stepped off a bus onto gravel with 2 bags and a name on a piece of paper, and no plan for what any of it meant. She was not even exactly the woman who had sat in a county planning meeting that morning and spoken 6 minutes of careful, documented truth into a fluorescent-lit room while Warren Tolliver arranged his papers on the chair beside him and would not look at her. She was something that had come after all of those women, something that carried what each of them had learned without being confined to what any of them had feared. She went to bed. In the morning, the light would come through the east window the way it always did now, reaching the kitchen table first and then spreading to the floor. And Tallow would be waiting by the door with the reliable patience of a creature that has decided this is home, and the garden would be there with whatever the night had done to it, and the day would be a day she had not lived before. She had stopped needing it to be more than that. It turned out more than enough.